Hi everyone. I'm Becky Murray. I'm the ESPA Impact Manager and have been working in the Directorate since I joined in September 2015. And I'm here to share some reflections today that have been emerging from a review of programmatic learning that my brilliant colleague Valeria Itzi has been carrying out over the last few months. Okay, so the aim of the webinar today, briefly, is to reflect on ESPA's experience in terms of funding and implementing research that aims to achieve development impact, and also to share the key lessons from ESPA-funded projects and for the programme as a whole. And just briefly, when we were putting this webinar together, we sort of, in terms of the audience we had in mind, we were thinking of researchers, development policymakers and practitioners, and funders and managers of similar research programs. So firstly, just in terms of setting the scene, we wanted to think a little bit about what we mean by impact. Impact as a term has become increasingly popular, and it's used both in international development and in academia, but there are significant differences in terms of how they're used by those two different communities, I think. So in international development, which is kind of my background really, it's a very well established concept, and OECD DAC kind of define it in broad terms as the positive and or negative effects that may be intended or unintended of a particular intervention. It can be operationalized in a variety of different ways, but in broad terms there's agreement, I think, over what we mean when we use the term in an international development context. In academia, it's a much newer concept, and it is evolving. And in a UK context, the research councils tend to think about it in two ways. So they talk about academic impact on one hand, and then they'll also talk about economic and social impact on the other. I guess my experience so far, at least, is that the language becomes a bit confused, often because people shorthand it to impact, and so then people aren't quite sure if you're referring to one or the other. You have confusing terminology like impact factor for academic journals, which when you're working on a program like ESPA makes people wonder whether you mean development impact or some other type of impact. So it's much more evolving and new and less well established in academia, and that has been really important context for the ESPA programme, I think. So other sort of scene setting, if we think about ESPA in particular, for those of you who don't know the programme so well, ESPA stands for Ecosystem Services for Poverty Alleviation. It was a global interdisciplinary research programme that was set up around 2009. And ultimately it was aimed at providing decision makers and resource users with sound evidence to address challenges related to sustainable development. It officially finishes in a week's time, actually, at the end of March 2018. So it's been a really long running programme, and we basically are in the process of curating a sort of legacy of lessons learned for funders and researchers tackling ESPA-like issues, and that's very much been on our mind as we've created this webinar to disseminate some of those findings. Particularly in the context, there are lots and lots of ESPA-like programs coming through the pipeline, GCRF being one of the most significant, and we think there's a lot of ESPA learning of relevance for those sorts of investments. So just briefly, to give you some sense of scale, the ESPA programme is quite large. It's almost 44 million over the programme period. That has equated to 125 or so research projects spanning more than 50 countries, and that's across Latin America, Africa and Asia. And that has involved more than 900 researchers, of which 50% are from developing countries. So this has been, quite a significant investment in terms of scale, and therefore there's lots and lots of learning at that scale, as well as the component projects. And one of the important things is that when it started in 2009, it was the first major collaboration amongst 3 funders. So you've got DFID, you've got the Natural Environment Research Council, and also ESRC. it was the first of its kind then, although there's been several programs since, like Shear and Upgrow, that have kind of emulated the partnership. But yeah, there was lots of new ground to break in as a new partnership. And then the other thing that we just wanted to note briefly really was that as we're drawing to a close, we've been focused for the last 18 months on establishing what we refer to as an ESPA legacy. So we know that the directorate and the programme, we've known for a while that they weren't going to exist beyond the end of March 2018, and we needed to sort of hand ESPA assets and insights over to individuals and organisations who can own and maintain and champion them beyond the life of the programme period. So in terms of our thinking, that comprises sort of several important things. So synthesis has been a really important part of that, both in terms of academic synthesis and also synthesizing the programmatic learning. In terms of impact, it's been about kind of doing impact, supporting impact, and evidencing impact where it's happened. And then in terms of these people and organizations to hand things over to, partnerships and networks kind of cut across the whole thing really. So making sure that we build appropriate relationships with people on specific themes. So impact and legacy and synthesis were very much at the forefront of our mind when we were thinking about learning, and it therefore felt like there were two levels at which it was important to do that learning. Firstly, the project level, so how impactful have ESPA's projects been? What has enabled or hindered that impact, and what lessons have we learned around that? And then the other level is the program level. So for us, what has been the value of a program approach, and sort of to quote Aristotle, like how have we made the whole, the programmatic whole, greater than the sum of its project parts? How do you turn 2 and 2 into 5? So that's really been what's keeping us awake at night over the last 12 months, and I hope to share some valuable learning with you around that today. So in terms of impact for the ESPA programme, just to recap, so the goal is to ensure that ecosystems will be conserved and managed more sustainably and in ways that alleviate poverty and enhance well-being for the poorest people in developing countries. So we need to do the research and then put it in the hands of decision makers and natural resource users who should do things differently as a result of the things that we've learned. And that is not a simple process, really. The impact agenda, as we noted earlier, has been changing significantly over the life of the ESPA programme. The development of a pathway to impact was always a requirement during all ESPA funding calls, but it was a relatively light touch requirement at the beginning of the programme. So, it was a paragraph really about, impact goals, but there was kind of little monitoring around it and little support around it. And so this first major collaboration between DFID, NERC and ESRC, who, as we've noted, have quite different notions of impact, meant that ESPA became a bit of a testing ground for how you can kind of reconcile and operationalize these different ideas. And not surprisingly, DFID have been at the forefront of the promotion of the impact agenda. And so for them, from the outset, development impact was clearly changing the lives of real people. But for the two research councils, on the other hand, they were, I guess, from the beginning, more attuned to the more academic notions of impact, and their requirements were less stringent, at least in the earlier years of the programme. And I think this has had real implications in terms of what was expected from projects with regards to the level of impact and the timescale over which it was expected, and the guidance that was provided to researchers. For many ESPA researchers, in terms of the learning that we've been doing, they say that impact has felt like a bit of a moving target, that expectations weren't always clear and priorities weren't always clear either at the project level or at the programme level. And this is something that we've had to deal with over the life of the programme, really. So a range of guidance documentation was produced over the years. So there was an impact framework as early as 2010. There was a theory of change manual produced in 2012, a research into use strategy in 2012, an impact strategy in 2013. And then in 2016, which is when myself and my impact colleagues were recruited as a new kind of rebooted team, we rewrote the impact strategy. We disseminated it via events in Africa and Asia, and as a team, we could then support implementation of it. And ESPA researchers have told us that that felt like quite a turning point for them, that they hadn't ever really been clear on what existed before 2016. They didn't know that the guidance existed, and they weren't supported to put it into action. And so, you know, that hands-on support around actually doing the work was really what was the game changer, so we've been told. And then just to show you, I guess, the shape of the team and the significant difference in terms of resourcing around this that 2016 made. So I came into post then. There was a colleague who was leading around impact and reporting. Valeria, who I mentioned earlier, has been leading around impact and learning. And then we had two regional evidence advisors, one based in Nairobi for Africa and one based in Nairobi for Delhi. Sorry, one based in Delhi for Asia. Yeah, together we were able to really, you know, start doing things quite differently in line with the impact strategy. And I guess the other significant change was sort of having a theory of change at the center of the impact strategy. And essentially, this is just about articulating how we moved from the left-hand side of the screen, so our kind of academic results and our academic outputs, to the right-hand side of the screen, which is about change in the lives of real people. And here is kind of where we get into another term that people use, which is research into use. And we've used that terminology a lot, but other people call it knowledge translation. Sometimes it's called knowledge brokering. You know, for us, it's all a variation on a theme, really. So it's the idea that you do the research and then that you work with potential research users to disseminate it in ways that are meaningful to them. And then, as I said earlier, they do things differently so that programs and policies and investments are better based on ESPA learning. This theory of change, I mean, we've illustrated it here very briefly, but if there's the impact strategies available on the ESPA website, and it's a much more detailed, drawn through explanation of sort of outputs through outcomes to impact. And it was a very important step for us in terms of prioritizing the work that we did in the last kind of 12 to 18 months of the program. And the other significant sort of introduction here was the idea of co-production, or a focus on co-production. So a lot of our projects had started doing it anyway. And by co-production, we're talking about working as deeply as possible with potential research users to respond to their interests. And co-production was really important at project level, but it was also part of the logic for creating those two regional posts that I mentioned earlier, because they were able to interpret that demand and the sort of stakeholder landscape at the regional level, so that we knew, you know, what was required from us, what were the sort of emerging policy priorities that we needed to talk to. So just briefly, how impactful were ESPA's projects? So of the 125 ESPA projects, you can see a broad range of positive results, really. More generally, I'd say outcomes rather than impact, but certainly the beginnings of what impact may accrue. And there are sort of, you know, varying degrees and types of impact. So some projects have sort of influenced policy at a global or national or local level. Sometimes it's about sort of influencing legislation. Sometimes it's about changing business practice. And there's quite a few examples as well of sort of direct benefits to local communities through demonstration activities. And as I said, just a note at the bottom, impact can take a long time to accrue, which we'll talk a little bit more later about. So with ESPA projects, you tend to see, short-term outcomes, positive short-term outcomes accruing that you can logically see becoming impact over time rather than deep impact accruing within the life of the project or program itself. And some examples of that, so I've just briefly included 3. So our Eco Limits project in Ghana there's a local partner, NCRC, and the National Nature Conservation Research Centre, who've been working with the National Cocoa Board to share their project findings and engage with growers and buyers along the supply chain. And they've been successful in working with the likes of Cadbury and Hershey and Nestle, who've signed up to a joint framework for action which commits them to halting deforestation in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire and protecting cocoa producers' livelihoods at the same time. So that's been a really nice example of kind of business influence. Then we have our Mikoko Pamoja project in Kenya, which is more of a sort of demonstration activity, really. It's very localized. But it was an ESPA funded project which researched mangroves' potential to store carbon below ground and the vulnerability of this carbon if the mangroves were cut. So the team quantified the amount of carbon dioxide emissions increased when the trees die and used this data to get accreditation to sell carbon credits via Plan Vivo. So far there's been more than $50,000 worth of income accruing through this scheme, and that's been reinvested in local projects in line with priorities identified by a village council, and that's been sort of new water pumps, a new school building, new textbooks, and new furniture for new schools, and that kind of stuff. So that's a really nice example of that localized impact that I talked about. And then the third one is a very different scale. So this is our ESPA Deltas project in Bangladesh. So they've created an integrated model to provide policymakers with a tool to evaluate the effects of policy decisions on ecosystem services and people's livelihoods in coastal Bangladesh. And they used some impact funding that was provided by the Directorate to work with the Planning Commission within the Bangladeshi government to analyse the potential impact of 3 real interventions that they specified in the draft Bangladesh Delta Plan 2100. So that's a really nice example of sort of potential policy influence. And then, so what have we learned and what has made the difference, really? So when you look across the portfolio of ESPA projects, you can see that some clear learning emerges. And the first one is around this time and relationship building. So, we can see that in pretty much all cases, it takes a very long time to build the depths of relationships and trust between partners and stakeholders to do co-production well. And to sort of produce research in a way that has the potential to eventually become impactful. It takes a long time and it's very time consuming. A lot of our researchers noted that it often felt like the core funding was about to run out just as you were getting to the impact work, which was a real frustration. And they again were noting that expectations were a bit unclear about that sometimes and unrealistic. So they often felt a bit kind of doomed. And I think sometimes when the sort of requirements around how to express impact, if it's a basic kind of pathway to impact paragraph, if it's been very light touch at the beginning, it doesn't really explain the complexity of what then might happen. And we found that a theory of change gives you much more scope to get into that kind of nuance. And actually, you can see that the ESPA projects that have produced impact or positive outcomes are often working with partners that predate ESPA by a significant number of years. So ESPA, happens to have been the period in which those positive outcomes are accruing. And then the next piece of learning really is around, it's linked to the previous point, which is around kind of impact capacity and resources for the research team. So you can see that where ESPA projects have been successful in impact terms, they often have a specialist team member who's been responsible for focusing on that work. So that might be an impact officer. Sometimes it's a sort of impact and comms officer. But importantly, comms needs to be sort of impact-focused comms rather than a generic comms role, I think. And then also the other thing that comes through quite strongly is around the sort of need for facilitation skills, because relationships are so core to the achievement of impact. People with facilitation skills can really get people beyond those kind of disciplinary sort of siloed conversations, as well as a range of different stakeholder interests. And then one of the things we just wanted to note was really around the travel budget, which is obviously a significant part of sort of ESPA project setup. So we were told very often that the travel budgets were often reduced and they were often cut, and that had meant that people couldn't spend the face-to-face time that they needed to build these relationships, and that was something that they regretted, really. So it was just to put on your radar that spending that time face-to-face and having that be a two-way exchange, so not just northern researchers going to the south, but southern researchers coming to the north too, was an incredibly important part of the puzzle. And then just to come back to this idea of a pathway to impact, really. So we know that it's important to have a clear plan, but that you also need to be flexible and seize opportunities where they emerge. A theory of change can help you do that. It can help to kind of keep you on track and clarify your thinking, but that you need to be prepared to, be aware of the fact that impact is non-linear, it's unpredictable, and it's often quite serendipitous. So you have to be in the right place at the right time and be prepared to act on these opportunities where they emerge. So just a few closing reflections. So at the project level, we wanted to note that impact cannot be seen as simply as an add-on. It fundamentally challenges the way you should go about doing your research, both in terms of timeline, timing, co-production, so the way you're working with your range of stakeholders. And it fundamentally means that a successful outcome might look very different, and researchers need to be kind of open to that idea, and funders need to be open to that idea too. And linked to that trade-offs exist, that you can't have everything all the time working perfectly in harmony. There will be trade-offs in terms of the idea of research excellence versus impact, and that sometimes that might feel that you have to do things in the short term that don't necessarily see you getting to where you want to be in the long term, and that there's a degree of flexibility around that that is required by everyone. And then at the program level, there's a couple of points that we wanted to make briefly. So we think there's a real potential to be greater as a whole than the sum of your parts, as we said earlier, but that requires certain things. So to maximize the potential impact of individual projects, having centralized expertise for projects to draw down on has been noted as being really, really beneficial. Sometimes that's just an external pair of eyes where project teams are kind of lost in the minutiae of data collection. Having someone who can kind of keep bringing you back to the conversation around impact can be really helpful. And in terms of the second point, to build on a project's previous foundations and deepen impact, several of our projects that have been impactful have had, a couple of rounds of funding through the ESPA programme, and a programme approach can give you the scope to do that. And then just on the latter couple of points, so then you have the potential beyond the project level to be, more powerful as an evidence base, because you are numerous projects looking at a similar issue. So the ESPA programme has shown that it can be valuable to promote connections and cross-learning among projects and a community of practice around particular research themes. And our thematic synthesis and sort of programme level research into use has really taken shape in the last year, and there's been some really useful examples of that. I guess the one thing I wanted to note was that what a program can allow you to do is kind of, and a long-term program at that, can curate and shape the nature of your supply side, so your academic offer, during the life of the program, so that you can respond to those demand side opportunities as they emerge. And we think that's been very valuable for the ESPA program, and that you can do things as a program that you can't do as an individual project. So I think that's all we've got time for right now. Thank you for participating. As I said, we'll follow up with the Q&A sheet afterwards by email. Thank you very much.